the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to this episode of A View from Afar. And today, political scientist Paul Buchanan and I will bring you a program in two parts. And first, we will provide a brief roundup of Russia's Victory Day on May 9th and what to make of Russia's President Vladimir Putin's speech. Plus, we will evaluate a raft of election results that have occurred around the world, including in the Philippines. There's Hong Kong, Sinn Fein's win in Northern Ireland, and Macron's re-election as President of France. And we'll look at what those election wins mean for geopolitics. And then Paul and I are going to analyse the Solomon Islands-China security deal. Now, this issue's been around for a little over a month, but it's certainly got some legs and enduring here. And so we're going to look at what those concerns are with respect to Australia, New Zealand and the United States. What's Solomon's interest in this? Is there hypocrisy, as we've detailed in previous episodes, but also what impact China's strategy in this regard may have on the Quad and the AUKUS security blocs, particularly from the point of view of the Southwest and South Pacific and also Indo-Pacific regions. But before we deep dive into these issues, remember, if you're joining us live via the social media platforms, do feel free to comment, as we can include this interaction and your questions, if you like, into this program. So let's get the show on the road. Paul is waiting online to join us here, so I'll just bring him online. Good afternoon, Paul.
Kia ora, Selwyn. How you doing?
Yeah, very good. Tanaku iho, and looking forward to this. And after a 3-week break, haven't we, Paul? And we're ready to go.
Quite the sabbatical, I must say.
Quite a sabbatical, yeah. So in the first instance, we're going to look at the Russian Federation, in particular with Victory Day or V-Day on May 9, and how Vladimir Putin delivered a speech. It was anticipated that the speech, obviously, it was is key around the world for people watching with concern as to what he was going to be indicating with respect to the conflict in Ukraine, and also how what those danger points may be from the point of view of escalation. But it was quite a different speech to what many had expected. Paul, what do you make of it all?
Well, it was all about managing expectations. And what I think happened, because it was only in the West where the speculation was that he would declare war in order to call up conscripts and reserves to fight the war, because it hasn't been going well. But actually, it's not as dire for him as many Westerners would like to think. And I'll briefly say something about that in a second. But it was about managing his domestic audience's expectations as to what they're going to get out of this conflict. It clearly wasn't the quick triumph that he promised them. And so now he's got to ensure that they don't want too much out of this adventure. Now, the good news for him, and the reason he can manage expectations is, it's a back to the future scenario. He's going to wind up more or less with what he could have had without the war. That is, territorial control over eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region in particular, or at least a lot of it, and perhaps the southern coast, although that's more contentious. But recent word is, even though the Ukrainians have made some good counterattacks and pushed them out of some villages and towns, the Russians, in spite of their ineptitude, have de facto territorial control over the separatist areas that they had already, and a little beyond that. He's basically linking up the two separatist regions in the borderlands of eastern Ukraine, again, in the Donbass, but particularly the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. And he may just call it quits at that point, although the fighting along the southern coast to create a land bridge between Mariupol and the Crimea, that right now is the big prize. If he gets that, the Ukrainians will be hard-pressed to come to a negotiating table because he's going to be slowly choking them off. But that's what the speech was about. It was like, there were a lot of Nazis threatening us. NATO was threatening us, blah, blah, blah. And so we had to do what we had to do. And now we're firming up the anti-Nazi campaign. But he's really diminished on his objectives. He's no longer voicing, friendly regime in the Ukraine or anything of the sort. So that's what it was. I think what happened, though, is in the West, there was this hype about, he's going to declare war. That will show that he actually is in really bad position, which would have been true. But I think he feels confident that he can retain his original goals. That's the irony, his original goals, and then perhaps at that point call it quits.
Do you think that was a smart move by Putin, or do you think that this is a reality check for him? And it's interesting how what your take was. He's managing perhaps public sentiment and that they don't expect too much from this invasion of Ukraine. We're obviously talking the Russian point of view. Is it smart or is it folly, his position there?
Oh, no, I think it's a smart move on his part. See, things have changed in the 3 weeks we've been away, in that the hawks in Washington, in London, and Brussels, they want to break Russia. They see an opportunity here that he's overextended himself. And they think, in fact, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, in an incredible breach of diplomatic protocol, said the objective was to weaken Russia so it could no longer do this again. And it was my left friends who first started saying this to me, but now I'm thinking there's a bit of truth to it. They're like, look, at the United States is slow dripping this war. They're giving the Ukrainians enough weapons to hold the Russians at bay, and through a process of attrition, weaken their armor. They just don't have the ability to resupply that the West does. I never would have thought that true, but the way the hawks are talking, this is no longer about the Ukraine. This is a proxy war between Russia, NATO, and the United States in particular, that Biden must think he can win. I'm not so sure about that, but the idea here in some parts of the West was to push the narrative that Putin was going to declare war for whatever his reasons were, but that would then justify increased NATO assistance, more direct assistance. I mean, we've talked about this, but the United States, some sectors, again, the hawks in Washington, leaked that the U.S. intelligence is providing the information that's killing Russian generals, and which was instrumental.
Yeah, that was interesting.
And instrumental in the targeting of the 2 Russian warships.
And we'd seen a change in US policy relating to intelligence on this right at the beginning of this conflict, of this invasion that Russia did, where they were basically open sourcing what would normally be classified intelligence on where he was positioning. This is before he went over the border, and they were assuring, and it looked like it firmed up. It looked like the intelligence was good. I know that there seems to be some sort of question between who's got the best intelligence. The Brits are trying to enter into the intelligence game, but it looks like the United States are saying, oh, no, we see it in a different way here on different points. But Paul, getting back to we'll just tidy this up a little bit from the point of view of, do you believe that Vladimir Putin is still intending to create a landlocked Ukraine by the south and connect those territories that he is, determined to hold in the south on the Baltic, on the Black Sea areas, with Transnistria, on the eastern side of Moldova? Do you think that he's still intending to try and connect there, or has he given up on that? Do you believe? I know Kherson is still in frame for the Russians, isn't it?
Yeah, look at he has those ambitions, no doubt. His ambitions are pretty simple. He wants to annex as much territory in eastern Ukraine and make it Russian. And he's already in the process of not only involuntarily removing Ukrainians and putting them in Russia, but he's appointed Russian mayors who are now demanding that everything be spoken in Russian curriculum. He's colonizing. For him, the best scenario now would be able to take a large swathe of Ukrainian territory from the Belarusian Russian border in the north all the way to Crimea. And then he can extend across the waterway into Moldova, or the separatist, parts of Moldova, basically as a check on any movements in and out of Odessa. I don't think he's going to be able to take Odessa, although he's trying to degrade their defensive capabilities. But that would be a victory for him, especially now that he's saying, look, it was about denazification. He's really making the point that as soon as they get rid of the Nazis, then they're going to leave. Okay,
Yeah.
so he's going to pin himself on that. And
But
I
of course,
think
there's the irony there that a lot of the our audience will be well and truly aware of, that Nazism by way of actions seems to be the MO of the Russians when they're invading on this thing. And meanwhile, people are dying and bleeding on Ukraine as it tries to defend itself, albeit with Western.
Oh, look, Nazism now is being used as a catch-all phrase for anyone who commits atrocities in any way, shape, or form. He's doing what he thinks he has to do. I will say one thing, Selwyn, about the intelligence game. For our Australian and New Zealand listeners, we're in that game. Yeah. I mean, remember, we've talked about it, but just to refresh people's memories, both Australia and New Zealand have human assets doing the signals and technical intelligence gathering that is essential to the targeting of generals and ships.
Yeah,
so
the geospatial, specialists that we sent up there as well. It's right in frame on that, isn't it? Look, getting just on just before we move off space on the Russian-Ukraine conflict onto the next topic, there's it looks like it's firming up as a reality that Finland is going to be positioning to enter into NATO, and it also looks like Sweden may follow there. Do you feel that really ratchets up the pressure on Russia, or do you believe that that's a foregone conclusion and they're actually working out their own tactics and strategies as a consequence, even if that does happen? Meaning it's less relevant to them than perhaps it was a month or two ago.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, Finland is a done deal. And Finland is a formidable military actor. Has 680,000 troops that can mobilize within a week. Has another 900,000 reserves. They're a very militarized country, precisely because of the Russians, and they've decided to join NATO. Their contribution to NATO will be greater than what NATO provides them. NATO provides them Article 5, the collective defense part. These guys are bringing serious warfire capability, so I don't think Russia's threats to Finland matter one iota. If they engage with the Finns at the same time they're trying to get out of the Ukraine, they're going to take a beating. But Finland is in, there's no doubt. Sweden's a little different. Sweden is a much weaker military power. It's weaker for many reasons I won't go into, but it's weak in one large measure, which is the government is divided about whether they should join NATO. Part of the ruling coalition as well as the opposition are against it. And Sweden has some good technology, but they gave up on conscription basically after 1996. Sweden abandoned certain ideas about its own defense. It really bought into that post-Cold War logic that everybody was going to have a group hug and it was going to, go well, NATO expansion, all that. And so their defense budgets are less than 1% of GDP. They're really not up with the play. Now, the more hawkish sectors of the Swedish defense establishment are like, we need to get up with the play. That may take a while. I don't think the Ukrainian conflict will be enough to motivate Swedish pacifists and other members of the opposition to jump into NATO's lap. So the Finns are in, the Swedes are on pause, but none of that is going to matter in terms of Russian eyes because they can't really do much about it. They can only threaten, but they certainly, again, for them to engage the Finns would be utter folly. And so I guess they're just going to have to grin and bear it.
Okay. Just before I forget too, I meant to bring up, and I don't need necessarily to play this, but what I brought up on screen is a photograph of Vladimir Putin delivering the speech. Now, as I understand, the United States were watching the generals and
who's missing?
Military bars. Yeah, who's missing? I understand too that Foreign Minister Lavrov was not there. If that is correct, that may be an interesting element. But also the head of the military forces, as I understand it, that general was not leading the show. It was basically the political counterpart from the point of view of seniority. So, Paul, just if you touch on that and just explain why that's significant to the audience, that'd be great.
Well, I will, although I offer this caveat. One of the things that was always irksome about Sovietology, when people used to study the Soviet Union, was they would be bean counting on who's standing behind, the president. And so it was always, who's on the outs, who's on the ins. And it didn't amount to anything because the larger currents underneath all these guys in their fancy uniforms are what really matter. And so that's the same here. Who's sitting where is much less important than Putin's thinking and his military capabilities. Now, having said that, because the Ukrainian war has not gone well, he's replaced military commanders, he's replaced intelligence people. And what I find significant is not so much the absence. I forget the guy's name. It's not the Siberian fellow who was the defense minister, but the guy who was the chief of staff of the military wasn't there. Lavrov, he may have been on, further out because this was a military day. I think what is interesting is the military officer who was in charge was the political officer, as you mentioned. That's Putin's attempt to signal his reassertion of a civilian authority over the military.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is there's always been distrust between the Russian military, who consider themselves professionals, not quite in the Western sense of military professionalism, but definitely, more nonpartisan, they obey the master of the day and all that stuff. And as a result, particularly since this guy, Putin, is a former intelligence guy, there's been a measure of distrust between the military and Putin's entourage, the Sloviki as they're known. And as a result, I think he's trying to, get them back under his thumb. And this was a very symbolic gesture that the political control over the military remains and will continue to remain in the foreseeable future. But beyond that, all these guys in their fancy braids, that's bean counting exercise that at the end of the day isn't as important as the undercurrents swirling below them.
That's very helpful. Paul, we'll just do a quick transition and then we'll come back and we'll just discuss in brief the elections that have taken place around the world in the last 2 weeks, a selection of them, I should say. Be right back. Yeah, over the last 2 weeks, there have been a raft of elections around the world, and significant among them, as we said in the introduction to the episode, are the results in the Philippines, Hong Kong, Sinn Fein's win in Northern Ireland, and Macron's re-election as President of the United States. Paul, what do you make of these results? And also, what impact do you feel that these results will have on the various geopolitical interests in various regions around the world?
Well, although there's not any particular discernible pattern given the national circumstances involved, there are some general trends that I'd like to briefly address. The first one is that all of these elections are confirmations of the old adage that all politics are local, all elections are domestic. International affairs didn't really factor in very greatly into any of the elections, with the exception of the victory by Sinn Fein in Northern Ireland, and other than the impact of the supply chain crisis all over the world. And this is all of those elections were fought on economic issues. Inflation. Every single country has problems with inflation, has problems with keeping things on shelves. There's mention in news recently about a infant formula crisis in the United States. Well, that crisis, for those who are in young childbearing age, is worldwide. And so it's the global commodity chain crisis that puts upward pressure on the price of increasingly scarce commodities. That is the general international trend that all of these elections were responding to. And I might add, there's other elections that have occurred earlier that are now seeing new presidents inaugurated, South Korea being one of them. They replaced the left center government, such as it was, with a right center government that's going to do a harder line on North Korea, but which was elected on economic grounds, first and foremost.
So we're seeing a thing that's like solution orientated wins here. That you've got, because for example, you've got authoritarian wins. Park Hong Kong aside, because there's very limited candidates in respect to Hong Kong for all the various reasons. Pardon the kind of humour on that, but it's not funny, obviously. But if we look at the Philippines, a return back to the son of its notorious, infamous dictator Marcos. So the son of Marcos is actually won at the ballot box, replacing another, Duterte, for example, that has just put a shudder down the spines of many who witnessed what happened under the Marcos regime. But is it solutions that they've pitched hard to the populations? Because once again, you look at Sinn Fein, totally different to what you're seeing in these other things that we just mentioned. But they've won on the basis of unification possibilities that could happen there between the Republic and the Northern Ireland. And also the EU border is a huge issue, isn't it, with respect to the United Kingdom voting for Brexit, a good couple of years ago, and the stresses that puts on Northern Ireland in particular, because obviously just to underscore the Republic of Ireland is a member of the EU and Northern Ireland no longer is.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let me try to break down each one individually since you brought up the Philippines.
Bit of a task, isn't it?
Yeah, no. It's actually there's as I say, there's domestic themes. So the broadest theme is economic instability around the world. Each country that we're talking about has manifest that. It was bread and butter issues that got these guys elected. That's it. Wasn't international relations, none of that stuff. Now with the Philippines, of course, we have a confirmation of the dynastic nature of Filipino politics. And what was disappointing is that a human rights lawyer was defeated in a landslide by Bong Bong. And I got to say, I have total respect to the Filipinos for giving great nicknames to their various dictators and politicians. Now, Duterte is pro-US. So again, the security hawks in Washington are actually applauding his victory because they think he's going to go harder on China when it comes to the Southeast Asian Sea, South China Sea, excuse me. The trouble, as you've alluded to, is that although he denies that he's going to replicate his father's rule, he is a political partner of Duterte, and in fact, Duterte's daughter is his vice president. So the law and order policies that Duterte imposed, which were basically homicidal, are going to be maintained and may even be expanded under Bong Bong's rule.
And, on that point with Duterte, I mean, the International Criminal Court has its scope looking at responsibilities relating to his war on drug traffickers, which was basically teams going out and killing.
Yeah.
So, that's the reality of the whole situation, particularly down in the Mindanao areas and in the heartland Manila. Yeah.
Oh, good for you to mention Mindanao because there's still an Islamicist insurrection on the island of Mindanao. But Duterte now has de facto immunity from prosecution by the ICC because Marcos is going to give him that immunity. Now, so what we have is, a return to dynastic populist politics, a continuation of the sort of hardline rule. This is no longer, well, it never was a liberal democracy. And in fact, if the Speaker of Congress in the Philippines has the name Aquino, then we definitely know there's dynastic policies at play. Not that that's going to happen, but the issue simply is that it's a return to that sort of hard democracy that the Filipinos seem to welcome, and in which this case was because they remain focused on those primary issues that we call bread and butter issues in the West, and the issue of crime. Now, Hong Kong will dispense. This basically meant with the election, quote unquote, of Mr. Lee, a former police officer, 7% of the country voted. 7%. And they voted for him. This is the end of one country, two states rule. This is the de facto absorption of Hong Kong into the People's Republic of China. That's what we've just seen now. I should point out, since we're in Asia, that South Korean election, which happened in February and the president was inaugurated this past week, that shift from left to right is seen again in Western capitals as good, because he's going to have a harder line on North Korea than his predecessor, the argument being that all the carrot that was waved at Kim Jong-un did nothing. So you might as well go back to the stick. The trouble is, every time the South Koreans wave a stick, the North Koreans do something provocative. They sink a ship. I mean, they actually up the ante. So we'll see how that works out. But what it means is that between the Philippines and South Korea, and then Japan turning rightward recently, you're having a hardening of the anti-China bloc in the northern reaches of the South China Sea and the East China Sea. That's interesting. And I'll touch back when we get to the Solomons, but Australia is about to have elections. And that'll be interesting to see, because China is definitely on the menu there, although they too are consumed by bread and butter issues. Now, France was a vote for a safe pace of hands that no one likes. They went for a centrist re-election because Le Pen scared the crap out of people, because she was overtly pro-Russia until the election campaign. Then she softened her rhetoric, and the left couldn't get its act together on a presidential candidate. So Macron, he's nondescript, but he was, in the idea of the electorate, he was the safest a pair of hands available. What's going to be interesting is they have parliamentary elections coming up, and both the right and the far left have reorganized to compete on the parliamentary elections, because that's obviously where legislation is made. So either way, Macron's in trouble, because he's never going to be able to pass his own legislation without the support of one or the other party. And that really depends on how those elections go. If the left wins big, he's going to have to bite the bullet and move in their direction. Macron is no leftist, but the right is a crazy right. The right is, sort of, MAGA-ish. And they're in Europe. I mean, they're being pro-Russia in the United States is one thing. Being pro-Russia under the current circumstances in Europe, that's dangerous. I mean, quite frankly.
It's interesting that backdrop that you're pitching there is perhaps key into Macron's behaviour immediately before the election campaign, and certainly significantly immediately after, where he has got some sort of vision shaping in his rhetoric and his speeches relating to the EU bloc. And he's been talking, hasn't he, about some sort of political solidarity relating to the EU, beyond just the Eurozone, but EU itself, that from a security and stability point of view. Now, it's yet to shape, but it's something I think we probably will watch very carefully, and perhaps should significant things come out of where France is positioning and what it's talking about by way of Macron in future episodes. But it's an interesting take there, I think, Paul, where he's positioning on the wider regional things as opposed to domestic immediately after the election.
Yeah, I mean, he has ambitions to make, France, yet again, the leader of Europe. He sees weakness in Germany under the new Prime Minister Schultz. It could be the French always have these glorious ambitions that are never realized in practice. But this could be a moment for that. What's interesting is that by pursuing a Euro dream. He's refocusing away from his domestic problems. Again, France, bread and butter issues are the issues. So moving towards the international arena is a fairly high risk proposition because many people may not buy into it and say, why aren't you concentrating on reducing the price of a loaf of bread? You know, all these input commodities are as bad here as they are in the United States, as they are in New Zealand. Attend to those issues first. So we shall see. One word about Sinn Fein.
Mm.
The big issue is twofold. Interesting that they have won the majority in the Northern Irish Parliament. I think a salutary event, in my opinion. Of all these newly elected governments, the only one that is nominally left-leaning, but they favor integration with Europe. In fact, under the Northern Ireland Protocol, Northern Ireland is still part of the EU. It's created, when Brexit occurred, it created a customs union across the Irish Channel. And what's happened is the unionists are in favor of Brexit because they feel that it cements the ties with the mainland.
They've fragmented, haven't they, in recent times?
They have, but they're dangerous. You know, there's the Northern Ireland has been ruled by coalition governments, usually fronted by the unionists, but with increasing presence of Sinn Fein over the years. Sinn Fein has had a prime minister in a coalition government, but now the unionists are saying, we want out of this customs union where we're still part of the EU, but it's not about economics. It's about reaffirming their ties to Britain, to the Queen. And they say, if you don't agree with this, then we won't form a government with you. And what happens when we don't form a government with you is civil unrest occurs. So although the talk is about reunification under a Sinn Fein-led government, the fact is you could see a disintegration of the peace consensus between the unionists and Sinn Fein. That to me, I'm like, if these guys really carry through on their threats, which is you abandon the customs union and adhere to Brexit or we're gone, that poses some trouble for the leadership of Sinn Fein. They're going to have to give up on one of their cardinal principles, which is retaining their independent relationship with Europe in order to placate the demands of the unionists. I'm not so sure that that's going to go over well in the rest of Ireland.
But the result would suggest that there's been a shift in the political alliances of that
in the
from
Protestant, in the Protestant minds. They wouldn't have gotten to the voting percentage that they did if there at least some Protestants hadn't crossed over and voted for them.
Yeah.
Well, then it is possible that the politics of yore that were rigidly religious in construction, sectarian for lack of a better word, are now dissipating under the pressures of globalization. Again, they also competed on bread and butter issues. That's why I'm reaffirming this common theme. And I think that for Protestant mothers, they're less concerned about the religious affiliations of the government leadership, and they're more concerned about their ability to deliver on basic wage staples like eggs, milk, and sugar.
Yeah.
So
and I'm wondering too if, like many countries around the world, New Zealand included on that. Some, New Zealand's case 4.5 years ago, but there was a generational shift that had occurred, and that was represented in the way the voting public addressed those general elections. And I'm wondering if that has occurred in Northern Ireland in particular, that the younger generation is now becoming, in numbers, a voting significance bloc, and that all the work that has gone on in the last, say, 15 years of seeing what was once foes as actual friends is starting to come home and damaging the stability that the unionists once had.
Yeah, I think that the global trend, and it's very good that you mentioned that with relation to New Zealand, is that, think of the kids who turn 18 between 2016 and now.
Yeah.
I mean, they've seen the whole Trump experience. They've seen a lot of bad things.
Yeah.
Plus, there's climate change. They've endured the pandemic. I think this generation, I won't say that they have PTSD, but they're going to be deeply marked by the negativities that have occurred globally as they came to age.
Mm.
And I don't think most of them are going to become MAGA types. I think they're going to go the other way.
Yeah. And
Much more.
that's the hope amongst a lot of people too, that the new generation there's a lot of hope wrapped around that new generation, isn't it?
Well,
As it's
look
coming
at
through.
the kids are not locked in to the prejudices of the past. I mean, you and I are displaying certain idealism, hoping that they're going to be better than our generation was.
Yeah.
But the hard fact is that the youth not only are our future, but they're not wedded to, again, the prejudices of the past. I always think of the old Cubans that I had to deal with when I was helping run the Cuba desk in the Pentagon. And gosh, they were fighting the war in 1959, the revolution, and this, that, and the other. And I was thinking, guys, you're in Miami, you lost, and the future of Cuba, if you truly love your homeland, is in the 25-year-olds, the 30-year-olds are going to run this place in 20 years. So let's give up on that, death to Castro, and let's think about the future. Well, now it's on a global scale, and you can see it. Well, let's put it this way. Be it in New Zealand, be it in Australia, be it in Ireland, be it in England, be it in the United States, opposition politicians blame the governments of the day for inflation, right? For supply chain problems. Those governments of the day have nothing to do with that. That is global capitalism. That is the failures of global capitalism.
Yeah, under the weight of a pandemic as well, or all these storms that have washed over the decks of these ships. Yeah.
Transnationalized capitalism in its present form could not cope with the pandemic, given the structure of production, trade, and exchange. What do we see now? Instead of rethinking the whole capitalist enterprise on a global scale, we've got a bunch of business elites who were the beneficiaries of the previous status quo now demanding to go back to it without regard for the mess, the aggravating circumstances that their status quo imposed on pandemic mitigation. Opposition leaders, instead of saying to governments, you did well here, but we need to reform there, and we need more sustainable economic growth, developmentalism with a conscience. They're like, we want to go back to business as usual. And that's no solution to this problem. So perhaps we've got to wait for a new generation to come in and go, we can mitigate pandemics better if we have different developmental logics. And by the way, there is a school of economic thought emerging fast called deglobalization. And the idea is to return national and regional autonomy to production so that you've got redundancies in the case of a global pandemic. Some regions that are affected badly will have to shut down production and trade, but other regions can take up the slack until such a time as the original ones can come back online. There is a rethinking movement at play, but I'm particularly influenced by some of the arguments here in New Zealand and then what I see in the United States, where it's like business elites think that nothing happened. We took 2 years off, and now let's just go back and do things like allow those floating petri dishes known as cruise ships to come back and disgorge 5,000 passengers at once so they can watch fake hakas performed by Indian guys courtesy of the cruise line. I mean, it's
what
that's
Paul's talking about there for the listeners, what Paul's talking about there is New Zealand announcing it's reopening its borders to include early in the end of July and including cruise ships, which hence Paul's comment about the petri dishes that float on the oceans. So, there's a serious and sinister kind of elements to this risk, isn't there? And I take your point about the shifts in solution-based economics, and it's almost like, we saw that happen really quickly when the pandemic started to bite globally, with the move back to stimulus coming from central governments around the world. So basically a modern version of Keynesianism economics. So what is happening now is a step. What happens beyond that stimulus, when stimulus starts to show issues relating to inflationary pressures and things, and all of that going up, but also the scarceness of what is basically seen as essentials in various domestic economies. And so all of that, so what's the solution to that? So there's a whole episode in that, Paul. Let's have a look at that. We'll keep it on our list of things that we will talk about. I'll just take a quick transition break. We'll come back with Paul. What we'll do for the last third of the episode is we're going to look at the impact of the People's Republic of China and the Solomon Islands security deal, and what that means for the security blocs that the West is embedded into in the wider Indo-Pacific and Western Pacific regions. And we're talking clearly about the Quad and also AUKUS, but we'll be right back. Come back to you, Paul, on that. Yeah, welcome back, people. As Paul, so let's just pick up on this, shall we? And we'll dig down deeper into this. The People's Republic of China, the Solomon Islands security deal. Now, this has been around for about a month, but we haven't yet really seen any definitive kind of examinations or analysis on what impact that has on the defence and security blocs that are operating there, and whether or not this is a move by China to indicate that it is not going to be satisfied with containment. So just over to you on that. What do you make of it all?
Oh, well, it's going to definitely change the strategic balance in the region one way or another. But let's put some basic principles out front. It's the right of any sovereign nation to engage in diplomacy and diplomatic relations, including military diplomacy, with any country it wants, unless it's tied into alliance systems and what have you that preclude association with other partners, hostile states. They can do whatever they want. Normally the regional security architecture is fronted in the first instance not by Australia or New Zealand, but by the Pacific Island Forum. And the Pacific Island Forum normally addresses issues of security in the first instance. I mistakenly said in an episode a while back that the Melanesian Spearhead Group was particularly focused on Melanesia. That turns out it was an ambition of Frank Bainimarama in Fiji. It never, reached fruition. He thought he could have a law enforcement arm, if you will, within the PIF.
And returns a dividend back to Fiji when it was under strapped for cash periods after the coup that he initiated.
Yeah, and as it turns out, at the time, the PIF the presidency was in Suva, and the MSG was led by Bainimarama. But that never, went beyond the rhetoric stage, and so I was mistaken when I thought it actually had become an operating arm. But the PIF has been trampled by larger powers, particularly New Zealand and Australia and the United States as the ultimate patron of the Australians and the New Zealanders. Now, I cringe, having grown up in Latin America, I cringe when I hear New Zealanders and Australians say that the Solomons are in our backyard. I can tell you from someone who was raised as a Latin American that the U.S. use of that term, that Latin America is in our backyard, breeds deep-seated and long-lasting resentment. People don't get past that. For all the symbolic reasons why backyards may not be the best, thing to refer to when you talk about your neighbors, right? Neighbors would be a better way. But that's exactly what's happened. The Australians in particular, but also some people over here, have gone hysteric about this deal between the Solomon Islands and People's Republic of China as a security agreement. Now, besides the fact of sovereignty, besides the fact that 2,000 kilometers away from the Australian coast is not exactly on its doorstep, although it's significantly closer, obviously. But the real issue here is that the details of the deal have not been made public. Now, mind you, the details of many security agreements are not made public. I could think of some involving New Zealand and Western powers that have never seen the light of day. And so the Solomons is well within its rights, again, to say, stuff off. We're not telling you what's in the fine print. But that's what has people nervous. The honest, let's say, international analysts are like, okay, what we know is that People's Republic of China police will now undertake the training of the Royal Solomon Islands Police Force in the way that the Australians and the New Zealanders did during the era of Ramsay. The coalition that was...
Yeah, that's the regional assistance mission to the Solomon Islands that was born out of instability in the Solomon Islands, particularly between Guadalcanal citizens and those of Malaita, the problems there. So it worked from the point of view of stabilising the country, didn't it, for a time?
It did. Yeah, it did. It took 10 years, but it did. Now, the Chinese have offered to come in and do the same training, except for one thing. They're very much emphasizing crowd control, those sort of things. But there's a clause in the agreement that says that the Chinese can send law enforcement, that's now a vaguer phrase, whenever Chinese interests in the Solomons are threatened by civil unrest. Well, you know better than most that when civil unrest happens in the Solomons, it's usually Chinese businesses that are scapegoated and are the target of a lot of that unrest.
And we've seen patterns of that in the recent histories around the Pacific. For example, Black Thursday in Tonga. Those when 80% of its capital city or capital town, Nuku'alofa, was burnt to the ground. 80% of it. The whole of that town, the capital, was considered a crime scene. In that case, the Tongans had to bring in the Australian Federal Police to actually investigate what had gone on. And they were the in charge agency. New Zealand was there providing stability support with our military mainly. But the point being is that was Chinese infrastructure that was targeted. Now, the Chinese obviously don't like that. They want their people to be safe wherever their diaspora is. And you kind of get that. But what this means is if there's civil unrest, it does the same. That's a foreign force comes into the Solomons, if we jump back to the Solomons, and settling down, if you like, the foreign force settling down the citizens of the Solomon Islands. That's an interesting take. That's something that the Australian Federal Police were not going to be doing in Tonga, and it does seem a different type of situation could develop should those flashpoints occur in Honiara in particular in the Solomons.
Yeah, and look at, the backdrop to this, and this is again for our extra regional listeners who may not be aware of this, the Chinese have colonized large portions of the Pacific. And usually what you see throughout the Pacific is that the business classes, the shopkeeper classes and whatnot, are all Chinese. And for a variety of reasons, that breeds certain resentment, and that's just raw racial animus already exists. But the fact that the Chinese are disproportionately represented amongst the business elites of various island countries exacerbates that resentment. So whenever there's unrest, even if Chinese interests are not involved, they will be targeted.
And now, there's another sinister element, just very quickly, I'll just inject into that too, that with respect to the Tongan experience in this, that there was a school of thought after all the investigations had occurred that the arsons in Nuku'alofa were actually sparked by what was referred to as the deportees gang. Now, interestingly, the deportees gang were those that had been deported from Australia and New Zealand back to Tonga, and largely on drugs charges. So they appear in the courts in those Western aligned countries. They find them, they're convicted, back outski to their place of origin, which was Tonga, and they formed a group and had taken their drug trading contacts with them, and that they were mainly connected via the Australian organised crime links to the western side of the United States and Mexico. And that's where the clash, because the Chinese interests, where drugs, methamphetamine, etc., bringing the precursors in from China, there was a clash. And that there is a school of thought, although it hasn't been proven in the courts, that's what was at the basis of it. So the complexities in the South Pacific, like every other region in the world, and that's just one of them. Yeah. So getting back to the Solomon, sorry about that, Paul. I just wanted to
at that point. No, that was great to bring up, because it goes off into why the deportee policy is not a good idea. It reminds me actually of the United States deporting gang members back to El Salvador.
Wow.
They took all their skill sets from being gangbangers in LA and New York, and they went back to an impoverished country that doesn't have the law enforcement capability to deal with their sophisticated skill set. So the drug trade and everything got worse, because these guys now had almost impunity. Well, when we think about the rise of Tonga, Samoa as transshipment points for drugs coming from the Americas, I wonder why that is. I mean, just as an aside. Let's get back to the Solomons, because here's the thing. Within the last 10 years, Chinese investors have squeezed out Taiwanese investors in major resource extraction, timber being foremost. The vast majority of Solomon's hard currency imports come from the timber industry. The Taiwanese were muscled out by the Chinese in the middle of the teens, and in 2019, the government of the Solomon Islands withdrew its recognition of Taiwan and recognized the People's Republic as the sole representative of China. Since then, the relationship has deepened considerably. Chinese investment has flown in, and as part of the security deal, again, where Chinese law enforcement forces will come to the Solomons and protect Chinese investments in the event of unrest, they talk largely about the Solomons joining the Chinese development train. And they talk about building shipyards, about exploring deep sea fisheries, basically joining the Belt and Road Initiative in a major way, which from the Solomons' point of view is a godsend. But which from a cynic's point of view goes, yeah, you're going to not join the development train, you're going to join the debt train. And you're going to wind up, for example, like Sri Lanka, which now can't pay its debts. And so the Chinese are looking for equity swaps with territory in Sri Lanka that they're owed money on. And the idea is the Solomon politicians are simply not savvy enough to understand what's going on here. They will find it very hard in 10 years to repay all of these infrastructure projects, which are designed for no Solomon's fleet. They're designed for bigger industrial fleets and all the environmental stuff that goes with it. So that's what's on paper. And that enough is cause for concern, at least in Western capitals. It's what hasn't been seen, which is the rumored agreement to allow the Chinese to establish a naval base in the Solomons. That's what has people hysterical.
So what is this plays pressure on the Quad and also AUKUS burgeoning as a security bloc in the Indo-Pacific region, doesn't it? In the sense that it's a wake-up call that China is not just going to passively sit there, it's going to actually push its envelope on its interests deep into the Western Pacific, if not beyond. Is this why Australia, New Zealand and the United States have been so vocal? And also what's behind perhaps, New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's recent bilateral, the first in 2 years, where she left New Zealand shores, went over to Japan, and out of Japan there was a number of things, but one of the things was a security intelligence sharing agreements that came out between New Zealand and Japan. Now, that was interesting from my point of view, looking at that, because New Zealand's a member of the Five Eyes. So obviously, United States, Canada, Britain, the United Kingdom, I should say, Australia and New Zealand, in that Five Eyes security group. And New Zealand's talking about intelligence sharing with Japan, which is firming up, as you've said, through to United States and Western interests in the security kind of arrangements with the Quad. And there's a picture, I suppose, without risking being muddled on this, a picture that starts to show. So where do you think that tapestry, if you like, is starting to tear at the edges, and what looks like is going to be the case in the next year or so?
Well, certainly, if there was any doubt that the Quad is an anti-China containment bloc before the announcement of the Solomons PRC deal, we're going to find out exactly what it is now, because they have to step up. And here, this is time sensitive. If you're going to prevent, assuming that the rumors are true and the Chinese, through subterfuge, are going to try to forward base in the Solomons and then project power from there, remembering that the Solomons straddle some major sea lanes in the Western Pacific. They're absolutely important. So if you put submarines forward base there, you put even some of the big surface fleet, that's going to cause trouble for the Australians on the way out and anybody on the way in, again, because they can wreak havoc, as World War II showed. I mean, nothing's changed in terms of the geography. Now, I think what we need to understand is the Quad needs to up its presence in this very region. So there's talk, for example, of establishing a joint Australian-U.S. naval base in Vanuatu. But that's playing catch up already. And what I fear is that there's two ways that this is going to play out. One is the overt way, which is using the Quad. And I have a feeling ASEAN is going to develop some teeth, because the Indonesians aren't going to sit there and watch the Chinese, who they have serious issues with, put a naval base close to them. They're closer to the Solomons than Australia is.
And of course, Indonesia, very contentious issue, this, but it's maintaining its firm fisthold on West Papua because of the mineral reserves, the wealth of what can be dug out of the ground with gold and et cetera, goes on for a long thing. So, Indonesia, just stress the point that West Papua and is right, obviously, in land bordered with Papua New Guinea, and there's the Solomons sitting right there.
Right. So if the Chinese pursue a similar strategy with the PNG or West Papua, then they got troubles. So they're going to have an interest. So I think we're going to see a redoubling of efforts to cement security ties between Indonesia and the Quad as a defensive alliance in the Southwestern Pacific against the Chinese. That's the overt response. The covert response, and here I sort of dredge out some of my own past, would be to foment a coup against the Solomons government run mainly by opposition members, militians in particular, to the current government.
So where would that pressure for that to occur, that covert operation?
There already is calls for a coup in Australia. Again, the Australians are both hysterical and hawkish when it comes to this deal. All right, there's very few moderate voices when it comes to the PRC Solomons. We in New Zealand, fortunately, we still have some moderate voices, although the anti-China lobby in New Zealand is also hysterical and saying this is a dagger pointed at us and this sort of thing. I think that in the capitals in question, so Canberra, Wellington, Washington, D.C., Jakarta, there must be some thought put to, rather than start militarizing the whole region. And again, the PIF is being trampled by all of this. No one's talking to them. No one cares. What would be a softer option? And I use that word advisedly. And it's to foment a coup that will remove the pro-Chinese government and replace it with something that's friendlier towards the West, what you might
Mm.
call a restorative
Yeah,
coup.
that's so obviously for obvious reasons, and notwithstanding the historical impacts that such manoeuvres have done in the past, and you're intimately aware of those from coming from South America in your experiences there. But Sogavare, the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands, was one of those that did help to lead a settling down of the clashes between Malaita and Guadalcanal when Ramsey, the regional assistance mission to the Solomon Islands, actually took hold. Where he differed perhaps in the course of that immediate history there was he felt that the Australians were reluctant to leave his shores and started to work within the Pacific Island Forum with, significantly, Helen Clark, as she led the New Zealand government at that time, to actually have a 5-point plan of Ramsey exiting from the Solomon Islands. So he's one of perhaps a nationalistic independence type of politician with respect to the Solomon Islands. That would be very destabilising, to say the least, on Solomon Islands' longevity as an independent functioning nation. Should the West dabble in its affairs like that?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think if you can get, again, Miletian frontmen
Mm.
to stage the coup and argue that he's strayed away from his original principles and he's cozied up too much, it may well be seen as cost effective to remove him that way rather than wait for the Chinese to build a naval base. Now, there's two things that need to be considered. The first one, and I think this is an Achilles heel of the bilateral treaty, is that the Chinese protection of their investments in the Solomons comes upon the request of the Solomons government. You remove him and you put a pro-Western government in place, they're not going to make that request. And if you back it up with, Australian forces in defense of this government, fearing that there might be some sort of Chinese intervention, then you've got a standoff. The Chinese are going to be a little loath to go 6,000 miles and find a bunch of angry Australians waiting for them, along with a government that's very divided. So that's a scenario. Again, I'm speculating here, but in intelligence agencies around the world, there are people, very bright people, paid to forecast, game out all sorts of future scenarios. And I would be very surprised if even here in Wellington, they aren't gaming out scenarios where, how do we stop this right now before the Chinese get too strong? Now, the other one is to convince him, and I also think this is probably happening right now, is the countries in question, and again, the Indonesians might be very helpful here, but the PIF would be very, very helpful. You quietly talk to the Solomon Islands government and say, no naval base, don't do it. Because what's going to happen if this comes out and it's a done deal, then the traditional patrons, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, they're going to get involved. There's no way that they are going to accept a Chinese military presence in the Solomons, a permanent presence.
Okay, if
And
you look at... Oh, sorry, I'll let you finish. Sorry,
I was just going to say, my final remark on that is this. They can still have port visitation rights. I mean, we have Chinese spy ships and the occasional frigate come down to the port of Auckland, hang out, replenish. Right now, that's what they're saying. They're saying, no, this is not a naval basing right. This allows Chinese warships to come in, resupply, show the flag, do all the things that Western countries, do. And again, we in New Zealand allow Chinese boats to come here. So if it's limited to that, I don't see what the problem is. I mean, obviously the Chinese have ulterior motives, but then again, everybody does. On the other hand, if it is a true basing agreement, I've already seen in the Australian press security hawks saying, look, that's a red line. I mean, that's not going to happen.
I'm not surprised. The temperature of Australian responses to the People's Republic of China from a New Zealand point of view, New Zealand-based point of view, is over-egged in many respects. But Paul, all of this is almost like we are witnessing in the last 18 months, but it's ratcheting up for obvious global issues, giving some energy to it. Reconfigurations, it's almost like a chessboard where the powers are moving pieces into position. If you stand back and you look at everything that is going there and the elements of this whole security clash, if you like, is the region, the wider Pacific, both from South Pacific across Western Pacific to the Northern Indo-Pacific regions, do you think that it is now more secure because of these security kind of maneuverings that are going on, or is it actually more insecure?
The latter. We should do a whole episode again about the transitional moment in international affairs. But I'll tell you this before I get right to the Pacific. The combination of the pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine means that when all of it's over, sooner or later, the international system is going to look a lot different than it did before these dual calamities. A lot different. And right now, we are in a moment of strategic flux where international norms have basically gone out the window. Might makes right. And so countries are testing each other. Alliances are testing each other. We see now that NATO has regrouped around its central core theme, which was defense against the Russians. Soviet Union then, Russia now, Russia aggression. This is what we're seeing in the Pacific. The Chinese feel this is their moment to push out the boundaries of their power into the blue water of the Pacific. Why? Because the U.S. is weakened, and it is. Demonstrably, the U.S. is weakened internally, and it's no longer able to sustain the projection of force that it was able to do before Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, now you can see the limits of U.S. power, militarily speaking, but it's the domestic fracture of the U.S., not just the electorate, but society, that has eroded the will of the United States to lead the West in the way it used to do. Well, then that means it's a moment of opportunity for the Chinese to get out and get some. Impose, and leaving aside the histories of colonization and all of that, if the United States, France, Great Britain can maintain presences in the far abroad, remembering that France, New Caledonia is still a possession of France. It has 6,000 troops in New Caledonia. These have foreign possessions. And no one really says anything about that except indigenous people whose land was usurped. Why should the Chinese be denied the same right, especially if they're negotiating with sovereign independent nations who are being treated as equals? There's a certain paternalistic and patronizing view emanating out of countries like Australia and New Zealand when it comes to the Solomon Islands, with a little more than a hint of racism, is that these guys are incapable of coming to the right decisions vis-a-vis the Chinese. Only we can guide them to the right decisions. That doesn't wash in the Solomons. It doesn't wash in Beijing either.
No,
and I
nor
think that's
amongst
what
the Pacific Island Forum. If they're wanting to contain the Pacific Island Forum, you don't talk imperialism to these groups.
Good point. Well, and that's again gets us back to, again, and you and I know this. I feel like we're preaching to the converted. The PIF, the Pacific Island Forum, should be front and center at negotiating a compromise on the larger ramifications of the bilateral security deal between the PRC and the Solomons. They should be there. We don't need, a bunch of white guy diplomats coming in and telling them what's in their own interests or what's good for them. And yet we're persisting, again, another theme here, with traditional approaches to the Solomons, condescending approaches, where we're telling them what's good for them and what's not good for them, even though they're sovereign and independent. And I think, no, what was it? Obama got in trouble for saying we're going to lead from behind. Well, maybe the colonialists want to lead from behind at this point. The Chinese are very capable of making all the mistakes of prior imperialists and then add a few of their own. So, and the Pacific Island Forum nations know that. I mean, we've been talking about Tonga, Samoa, less so about Fiji, but they know the Chinese. And so I think, if we put them in the front, give them the respect they're due, since it's their region, basically, we're on the outlier of that region. Then something that an accommodation can be made where the Chinese are allowed the rights and privileges that any other country allowed, and stops short of forward basing rights that would destabilize the military strategic balance, not so much because of what the Chinese may do, although I have my concerns about that, but the response of Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. The response clearly is going to be Australia is going to militarize, the United States is going to put troops and naval assets in Australia, and they already have assets in Darwin. It will militarize the region, and that's a very big fear here in New Zealand. You're absolutely right. Most of us think a little differently than the Australians. Our security hawks want to march, step and step with the Australians, but a lot of us are like, that's not necessarily the way we look at this picture. And so hopefully our diplomats are trying to work with the PIF to find an accommodation, a compromise that will allow everybody to save face, will diminish the temperature of the arguments about strategic balance in the Southwest Pacific, and we can get on with our lives, hoping that the Chinese come through with some of their developmental promises.
That's the hope. That's the hope, isn't it, Paul? Okay, thank you, people, for joining us through the live recording of this episode of A View from Afar, and we'll be back in a short time with another episode, with another raft of issues that no doubt we will be digging down deep into and evaluating with our analysis. Paul, thank you for your company. Thank you for your insight and also your guidance through these complex issues. And we just got Di Trow has just made a comment on there. I'll just bring it up before we say goodbye. And that is, she says, fascinating. I learnt a lot as always. Thank you both. Isn't that cool? Thank you, Di, for that. So we'll go out on that, enjoying our praise, and we'll see you again. Kia ora. Ka kite anō.